During his media availability, Shedeur Sanders took time to credit Jackson State for building the player that you see today. Oh, yeah, it's Locked On HBCU. Play my music.
You are Locked On HBCU, your daily podcast covering HBCU sports. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, family? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On HBCU podcast, your number one daily one-stop shop for everything HBCU athletics, Monday through Friday. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I, of course, am Darian Gray, a.k.a. the Mouth of the South, Texas Southern alum and former TSU Herald Sports editor and current contributing writer at USA Today's Saints Wire. Thank you for going on this journey with me. Make a Locked On HBCU your first listen of the day every day. And remember, just because the mic cuts off does not mean that the journey's over. It just means it's time to follow me on Twitter at South Exclusives. Starts with an S and ends with an S. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is here, and there's no better way to make every play more exciting than with FanDuel Sportsbook. New customers can bet just $5. And if you win, you'll score $200 in bonus bets. Download the app or head to fanduel.com to get started. We'll wrap up today's episode with a look at Norfolk State saying we are the best school when it comes to basketball, and I don't care what gender that you're picking. In segment 2, we'll also take a look at North Carolina A&T. They're calling back to a past era, but I wonder if they're going a little too far with how invested in the golden era that they're being at this current moment. But we want to kick this whole thing off with a little bit of Shrine Bowl news. You know, I was at the Shrine Bowl over this weekend and then also Monday. Really good event. And one of the things that stood out was Shedeur Sanders and his media availability. Now, a lot of people had questions about whether or not Shedeur would participate. I didn't expect him to participate, to be honest. I didn't think that he would come out there knowing that he was a first or second or third overall pick and say, yeah, I'm going to do this. I didn't expect that. But he did get to talk to all the teams and those things and also reporters. When he was talking to reporters, also he didn't participate for the record. But when he did talk to reporters, there was obviously questions about his collegiate career, which involves Jackson State, and that came up. And he had this to say about JSU, and he really engulfed all HBCUs in this. He said, HBCUs are definitely a part of my foundation. I'm excited to be a part of that class and in that community. He also said this, going there and experiencing that, then moving to a Power 5, we changed the program at Jackson. We changed it at Colorado. We did everything people didn't think we'd be able to do. That's why I'm the most guaranteed risk you could take. I want to say this before we get any further. I've never had a problem with the Sanders brothers, right? Like I've never had a problem with Shedeur Sanders, never had a problem with Shiloh Sanders. Like they've been good in my book, right? Like I really ain't never had a problem with them. And I don't think I've ever said anything bad about them, to be honest. But this feels consistent with what I've always heard from Shedeur and Shiloh. I've always felt as if there was a lot of love from those two guys. Vocal love, might I add. A lot of vocal love for those two guys. I remember when it first happened, when he first made that move to Colorado, there was reports that basically Shedeur and Shiloh were tore up about it. That's what I remember. And I'm not going to say I get a torn up vibe, but I will say that I do get a true love and appreciation from both of the brothers. So I've always appreciated how they've talked about Jackson State. And I feel like we should continue to make that a part of their story because so often the HBCU gets erased. Let's use a couple of examples. I'll use Bashul Tootin. I would really be interested when Tootin leaves, because he's going into the draft this year. When he leaves and he gets drafted, does anybody talk about his time at North Carolina A&T? I'm not quite sure that they do. I'll use Tank Dell, where this already has happened. I never hear people talk about Tank Dell and what he did at Alabama A&M. You never hear that. You hear about what he did at UH because, quite frankly, that's what got him drafted. I don't have a problem with it. I understand the game, right? I've grown to a point where I've done media for so long that there's certain things that I don't like and I hone in on, and there's certain things that I don't like, but I accept that it's just what it is because it doesn't matter that much to me. And quite frankly, Tank Dell getting that Alabama A&M connection or Bashul Tootin getting North Carolina A&T connection doesn't really mean a lot to me, right? Because I know that for many people, when you transfer from a small school to a big school, you're not going to get the small school production discussed often. It's just not going to be the case. But here's the difference between Shedeur. Also, if you're a North Carolina A&T fan and an Alabama A&M fan, you should push those guys. But like I would do that for Isaiah Hamilton, right? Like I know he went from Texas Southern to UH. I would continue to hold on to what Zay did at TSU because that's what you do as an alum. But for me, I'm not really. I'm just in a media chair. I do feel like if you erase Jackson State from Shedeur Sanders, you're missing a large part of his story. You got to remember, he spent 2 years at Jackson State. He spent the same amount of years at Jackson State that he did Colorado. And quite frankly, he had a greater level of success as far as team-wise at Jackson State. You want to talk about Tank Dell and Bashul Tootin. For many people, those players rose to prominence at their FBS school. That was not the case for Shedeur Sanders. Shedeur Sanders rose to prominence in the collegiate football world at Jackson State. He was on national magazines at Jackson State. Do we understand that there's a lot of things that went into that? 100%. This is not saying JSU put him on, but this is to say Jackson State is a huge part of his story. And if you were to only talk about what he did at Colorado, you are actually you are intentionally cutting off half of his career. It's not no, I didn't know about him. I found out when he started going to Colorado. That's not true. Like that's just simply not true for a lot of reasons, but mainly who his coach was. And yes, who his dad was. I understand that's the same person. But at the end of the day, the reasons that the truth is the truth does not make it any less true. So we still have to acknowledge it as the case. That's one of the things people are like, oh, that's only because. I don't care what is only because. Like that's what it is. Let's look into what he actually said as well. Let's see what he actually said. He said HBCUs are a part of my foundation. I agree. Because we look at where he stepped into Jackson State, like what part of his life he stepped into. I could argue that your first couple of years in college are extremely instrumental in building your foundation. I could really say that. Your independent foundation, what you think outside of the restrictions of a household that built those foundations. Let's say it's the second floor. Let's say it's the second floor of a skyscraper. It's still one of the building blocks, though. That's just my opinion. I'm not a carpenter, so there's probably a better reference I could have made, but I'm not making it. I don't know if Shedeur had that same feeling as a person because, his dad was there. So it wasn't necessarily the independence factor that many people get when they go to college for the first couple of years. But at the same time, if we're talking strictly football, because we don't have to speculate, the speed of the game, the process of the game, actually experiencing the game, all of those things happen for the first time at Jackson State. So when he says HBCUs are definitely a part of my foundation, that's true. Does being Deion Sanders' son probably come with preparation before you get to college? 100%. But I do also know there's people who prepare before they get there and don't always live up to it. There's former athletes' kids who prepare before they get there and don't always live up to it. Some things you just have to experience. And I would assume the speed of the game, as good as his dad is as a mentor, he probably couldn't prepare him for the speed of the game. That's something you have to feel. And he did that at Jackson State. There's things that he built on at JSU that he took to Colorado and eventually made him the second overall pick. Does he get that recognition if he doesn't leave? Probably not, because we know what happens. You're going to get the small school conversation. But at the same time, you can't erase it. Just because he catapulted to this stature with Colorado does not mean that Jackson State didn't play a part. So I agree with him. And then also, I thought it was interesting how he went in and he wrapped it to himself. That's why I'm the most guaranteed risk you could take. I thought that was funny. That made me laugh, at least. There's no deep dive into what a guaranteed risk is or what Shedeur's status is as a quarterback. No, none of that today. Probably none of that ever on this show. But go check out Locked On Buffs if you want to hear that. But Shedeur, uh, I think he's right to make sure that Jackson State gets the love. And I do believe that it shouldn't be a forgotten part of his story, unlike many other HBCU players who transferred to the FBS. Because for him, it's not the same. That beginning is simply not the same. Now, as he pushed forward, North Carolina A&T, they're calling back to a past era. They're calling back to the golden era. But I have a question after they've hired Sam Washington. Are we now going a little bit too far with how much of that past era we want to get back? Let's explore that as we continue with Locked On HBCU. This is a message from our sponsors, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you were going to get any money. Now, Taxes is easily uploading your forms to a TurboTax expert who is matched with your unique tax situation and is going to give you undivided attention. An expert who's backed by the latest technology was cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you will get real-time updates on their progress, so no more waiting and worrying. You just check in and see where they're at. And you get your most money back guaranteed, all while you go on about your day. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now this is Taxes. Intuit Tax, TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only in iOS mobile app. See guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. As we continue rolling on today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you're checking out Locked On College Basketball. We're getting into basketball season a little bit more, especially in the collegiate world. There's no more football. Now it's time to move on with Isaac Shade to the basketball courts. I want to continue talking about this football game, though. We're going to get to basketball at the end of our show, but I want to continue talking about football right now. North Carolina A&T is doing a lot to call back to when they were great, which at first I didn't have a problem with. But now that we're talking about Sam Washington joining as essentially a consultant, I begin to wonder, look, is this too much? At what point do we say enough is enough? And it's not that I necessarily have a problem with Sam Washington at all. But then you start looking, the old head coach is back. One could argue, and I'm gonna dismiss these points, but one could argue bringing in the old head coach could result in players going to him, could result in coaches kind of valuing his opinion more. I'm going to dismiss that because I do feel like everybody is aligned. I do feel like there's an aligned vision and an understood head guy, which is Sean Gibbs. But I do think that that would be something that people would say. So because people would say it, I wanted to address it and knock it down. But my concern is simply the fact that if we're doing everything how you did it when you were successful, are we trying to set a standard or are we expecting a result? I was listening to this video and I wish I remember the name of it, but it was about this it was about the song The Ruler's Back. And this artist from New York, Joey, he was basically trying to recharge the city and whatnot. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I do believe that the context is important. And this guy said basically Joey is trying to reheat cold French fries. Well, that was interesting because it brought up a real good distinction. There's one thing between feeling nostalgic and kind of leaning on old principles, leaning on old aspects, like, oh, look at how we wearing the clothes they used to wear in the 90s. Cool. But then it's like, if you're trying to recreate the 90s, that's a whole different conversation. Maybe you don't understand that analogy. Maybe it wasn't done well. Let's continue with this. I'm afraid that instead of trying to lean on principles that made North Carolina A&T successful in the past, they may be trying to lean on people who made North Carolina A&T successful in the past. Though that may feel like a good idea, and I'm not sure that it's not, my doubt comes in the fact that if I go get this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy, I'm kind of expecting the results that came with them. It's one thing to say, well, when North Carolina A&T was at their best, they knew how to run the football. They prioritized physicality. So now that I'm leading North Carolina A&T, I'm going to make sure that we run the football and prioritize physicality. That's one thing. And I don't think you can really critique that, which is how I felt when I was talking about it for the past couple of weeks. I wasn't saying groundbreaking information when I said that North Carolina A&T was trying to get that old feeling back. But now with Sam Washington here, you're bringing a coach, it almost feels like we're getting everybody back. Let's try to get that same, let's just try to be that again. Let's try to be a continuation of a great era. Let's try to do that. And that's why I kind of I draw a line. Let me try to sum it up in a more compact fashion. So if North Carolina A&T wanted to lean on certain principles, that's okay, because I think there's attributes of a team that you could believe lead to success. But if you think that bringing all these guys in is suddenly going to make you successful, I don't think you can feel that way, because where you had your most success was in the MEAC. See, now you've gone through the MEAC. You did go to the Big South and had a good season, but now you're in the CAA. And not only are you in the CAA, you're trying to bring back guys who are on that team years ago and expect the same result. If that is the case, that is a problem. It's important to say if, because there's a lot of speculation here. And I support bringing back one of the defensive studs and making you a defensive coordinator, because quite frankly, Sean Gibbs already had that. And here's the other thing. I'm talking about the difference between trying to restore attributes while also recreate a team. That's the real contradiction right there. When it comes to North Carolina A&T, adding all of these former players and coaches onto the coaching staff, I always have to question, are you trying to restore the principle? Are you trying to showcase this is what North Carolina A&T football is about? Or are you trying to say these guys were present when we were successful, so now we're going to bring them back so we're successful again? The biggest hurdle in that is A, me not knowing for sure, and then B, understanding that the leader, Sean Gibbs, came from that era. So the idea that he would want to recreate that, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's trying to be nostalgic and fall back on an era of success. What it really means is, this is how I was taught. This is what I align with. This is how I view the game. So it's always going to be some sort of overlap when you're bringing somebody back from that era. So I can't really critique them too heavily for having a lot of pieces from the golden age. But at the same time, I'm scared that maybe fans may deliver or come up with their own set of expectations of, well, when Sam was here and Gibbs was here, we were this. So now that they're both here again, we're going to be this again. Different conference, different time, different players, different situations. There's so many things that are different that if we're talking about restoring principles, cool, that's a foundation. If we're talking about recreating a team, I get a little bit worried because it's risky. It's not me coming here to critique the decision to bring players and coaches back aboard. It's just me wondering the intention. And I know that last time I did that was with Deshaun Jackson. Didn't work out too well. Let's see if North Carolina A&T understands I'm not completely criticizing this time. I'm simply questioning. You want to have a conversation? Let's do it. As we push forward, there ain't no more conversation. Norfolk State said we are the top dogs. I don't care if you're talking about the women. I don't care if you're talking about the men. The MEAC runs through us in 2025. I want to explore that as we continue with Locked On HBCU. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, and FanDuel is the official sports book of the Locked On Podcast Network. There's only one more game in the NFL season. I understand, and I hope that you understand by now, that this is the most bittersweet time of my year, every single year, because football is over, but it's also the best game that we get to watch. The Kansas City Chiefs versus the Philadelphia Eagles. I already know who I'm going for, and it for sure will never be the Eagles. But when you're looking at that game, Jalen Hurts, Travis Kelce, Patrick Mahomes, Saquon Barkley. You have defensive players that you could highlight as well. Chris Jones, Jalen Carter, Trent McDuffie, HBCU own Joshua Williams. Who do you feel like is going to have a good game? Who do you feel like is going to come out victorious? All you have to do is go to fanduel.com, and if you put down a $5 bet, you'll get $200 back in bonus bets if you win. So all you have to do is go to fanduel.com or go to the app today to make every moment more. As we're wrapping up today's episode of Locked On HBCU, I appreciate you for making this your first listen of the day every day, making it all the way to segment 3, and I thank you 2 times for that. Thank you. Thank you. Norfolk State really said, we run this. On Saturday, you had the doubleheader of Norfolk State versus Howard, men's and women's. I do believe that those are two completely different situations. They stepped into the season as two different situations. They stepped into that game as two different situations, but they walked out with the same result. And that was Norfolk State saying, we are the top dogs. We run this yard. Because if you're looking at the men, it was Howard, then it was Norfolk State in the preseason polls. So Howard's projected to be the number 1 team. As you step into that game, only one of them had a loss in conference, and it was Norfolk State. So it was 1-2, the same way that the preseason poll projected it. But then what happens? You end up getting a freaking blowout. I mean, this wasn't even close when you're looking at this game, and Norfolk State took it. Let's see the final score. I want to make sure I get the final score of this game because Howard is on a 3-game losing streak, but this was the worst one to me. So 92-75, Norfolk State wins. And the reason it was the worst one is because of the stakes. See, we can have arguments about Division II competition, and we'll talk about that in a second. But when you're talking about stakes, you lost to Bowie State, you lost to Morehouse, but you were still number 1 in the MEAC. And at the end of the day, is there anything that matters more than winning your conference? No. And those 2 games that they lost in the last, or the 2-game losing streak they were on leading into this matchup, did nothing to impact the ability to win the conference. So you step in here, Norfolk State, 4-1, or excuse me, 3-1 at the time. Now they're 4-1. Howard was 3-0. Now they're 3-1. And in my opinion, it was a y'all must have forgot who we were type of moment. Y'all must have forgot who we were. We still run this yard. I know Howard took it last year, but this is us. And it's interesting to see Howard and Norfolk State go toe-to-toe in both the men and the women, as far as not just on a given day, but specifically in a 1-2 matchup. We're first and second place. We, at the end of the day, we're the 2 best teams. It's something that you can't get in football because there's just no women's football. Like some schools are starting to have women's flag football, but even then, the popularity, the situation, unless you're going to have a women's flag game right before the tackle football game, like it just it can never be the same situation, you know? Like let's say that it was Jackson State and FAMU for years, and in women's flag football, you had that as well. You might not even meet the recognition, but right now, the women's basketball game, and I was talking to somebody, I was talking to Gerald, I ain't got to hide it. He was talking about Norfolk State. He said he saw them up close. And Johnson is absolutely insane, right? You're looking at, but we're talking about the men right now. You're looking at the men, and in the men's game, they really kept a hold on freshman sensation. You know, like Blake Harper is a guy who has been on fire, but the last 2 weeks, or excuse me, the last 2 games, he hasn't really shot the ball well. And that's been a huge problem. So you're looking at a guy who he scored 15 points, which ain't too bad, but 7 of those points came from the strip. You're looking at 15 points, 4 of 13 shooting, though. So that was a real struggle for him. The last game against Morehouse, he went 2 of 10. The week before that, or the game before that, excuse me, he was 4 of 9, which isn't terrible. He didn't take a lot of shots that game, but still wasn't great. He hasn't been knocking down a 3 consistently, but he has been getting to the free throw line. That's probably the one thing that you could say that Harper's done very well, but he's a freshman. I do wonder if you're concerned. A lot of people's like, oh, they lost to a D2 team in Morehouse. And I hear you. I hear you. I think it got drowned out by the fact that people like, there's not that much of a difference. But you also forget that they lost to Bowie State the game before. And when you lose to Bowie State the game before and you lose to Morehouse, and now that's 2 back-to-back Division II games. I don't care that they lost those 2 games. This was still a big-time matchup. But it just makes you wonder what kind of trajectory that Howard is on right now. Because they're on a skid for sure. They lost to Bowie, they lost to Morehouse, now they lost to Norfolk. This was the first one that really hurt them, but I do believe in the court of public opinion, as they say, that one hurt them too. That one hurt them too. Those 2 hurt them as well. Now on the women's side, it's not the same. There was no Howard had the upper hand. Can Norfolk State prove that they coming back? No. Norfolk State women's basketball is a buzzsaw. And at the end of the day, any game that they walk into against any team, it's a matter of, can they stop this buzzsaw? They are going to be the favorite until they're not. And when they're not, that will be the tournament, the NCAA tournament. If they make it there, if they lose, they're going to be the favorite every single step of the way. And this Howard versus Norfolk State game means more because it was the Spartans who came out victorious last year. It was the Spartans who were in the tournament. It was the Spartans who were returning their top 2 stars. And yet it was the Spartans who were tied with Howard. And I think that from my conversation with Kiara Wheeler, or was it Diamond Johnson? I can't remember. I talked to them both. Great episodes. Go check them out. But one of them spoke about, and I think it was Wheeler, hey, this game does mean more. Yeah, that was her. I remember it now. That game does mean more. And I don't think that you can deny that. And I think it showed. They whooped them. It wasn't in general. Both games were looked at as who's going to have the power in the conference. And on the men's side, it was 92-75, an absolute blowout. And there was no question. You have Howard, who's over here reeling on a now 3-game losing streak, and they got beat down that way. The power has shifted, even if temporarily. Then you look at also Howard hasn't scored over 80, and I don't think in any victory, and they haven't scored over 80 in the last 3 games. So I just want to put that out there. Maybe that's the number to look out for. That 3 games is the magic number for Howard men's basketball. But for the women, Norfolk State won 16 or about 16 points, 69-53. And you're looking at, they crushed it in the second half. They outscored. It was really kind of close in the first half, to be honest. You had 13-16 Norfolk State. Then you had 16-10 Howard. So now you're looking at Howard actually having the lead at halftime. But once halftime came out, stick the fork in them. You had 18-8 Norfolk State. You had 25-16. So that was the most high scoring quarter that they had in that game, but you won by 16 points. Had a 10-point edge and then a 9-point edge. So you really see, though it was more high scoring, it wasn't one-sided high scoring. You just both were putting up points, and Howard couldn't stop Norfolk State. Howard could not stop Norfolk State. To put in great comparison, in my opinion, Norfolk State scored 26 points in the first half. They scored 25 in the fourth quarter. Big-time players, big-time games, and that's exactly what happened. If you were curious, you're looking at Diamond Johnson with 24 points. You're looking at Kiara Wheeler with a 17-point double-double. And Johnson had 8 boards and 7 assists to go along with her 24 points. So they impact the game in so many different ways. I think that is beautiful. I love seeing that. It's a buzzsaw. I mean, at the end of the day, the MEAC runs through Norfolk, Virginia. I appreciate you. On tomorrow's episode, we're going to get a little bit of an update on Aaron Smith's Shrine Bowl. He did not practice, and quite frankly, I believe that was the right call for him. And you think the celebrity coaching stops at HBCUs? I got one more to show you how much of a trendsetter that HBCUs have been. In the meantime, in between time, until the next time that we hear each other, family, take care, stay blessed. Peace.